wishing up the wrong tree, or why the EU is as unfit to resolve the current refugee crisis as the banks were unfit to resolve the financial crisis. That's a poor title. I'm sorry about that. Maybe it should have been in an analogy with the US in the Middle East or in Afghanistan, which we've seen are not really making things work. Or maybe we should say that, talk about the auto industry as not so fit to resolve global warming. But what I'm getting at is simply to tell a brief history of EU cooperation in refugee matters, asylum policy. I've done research on that almost as long as this cooperation has been in place. So the cooperation started in the mid-80s. I began my work in the early 90s. This involves Schengen, the Dublin Convention, and all those things that have been going around in the media reporting on the refugee crisis right now. And what I'm getting at is basically to take seriously the constant references to Europe as a solution. I want to turn that around and instead say that maybe it's time to see Europe as part of the problem, meaning the EU. The reason for that I will show you by making a few illustrations from EU refugee policy and migration cooperation in North Africa. But it's just to show that there is a history here, and that history is partly explaining why we are in the crisis now. And the EU has everything to do with that history and with the problems we are facing now. That's why it's a bit strange to constantly ask for more Europe, when in fact more Europe has meant more refugee crises. A good way of putting it is the little thing I found by Martin Wolf in the Financial Times, where he said very, very accurately that the last thing the EU wanted to deal with was a tide of refugees. But this has always been the case. The EU never wanted to have refugees on its territory. And I think that is not understood in the current debate. There was never any preparations for admitting large numbers of refugees to the EU. From the mid-80s to the early 90s, the EU decided to get rid of or start the process of getting rid of internal borders in the EU. Now, a prerequisite for that happening was the simultaneous strengthening of the external border. And the EU never missed emphasizing that, whether it was the EU institutions or the member state governments. Thus, the Schengen agreements, hard policy on external borders as a prerequisite for tearing down internal borders. This was also a message to the European citizens, being told over and over again in the 90s. Assuming an EU citizen that was afraid or nervous about borders being taken down inside the EU, the European Commission could always reassure the EU citizen that this would never imply an increase of immigration or asylum seekers from outside the EU. The whole point of tearing down internal borders was to erect them even more firmly at the external borders. So that's, and part of that is, of course, the discussion today about the difficulties of getting, of refugees, that they don't have regular ways to enter European Union space. They only have irregular or illegal, as it's often called. They have to make use of smugglers in order to enter European space. That is because the EU cooperation has focused a lot on hindrance. So visa, blacklists on countries who need visas to enter the EU. And those countries are always those countries who produce refugees. Carrier sanctions, harsh militarized borders and militarized border controls. Those have been the instruments implemented through European cooperation on refugee and asylum policy. So that is just to say that there never was an intention to admit large number of asylum seekers. The only reason we have a large number of asylum seekers now is because the Greek border and the Mediterranean, they are still, people can still come that way via smugglers and irregular ways. So the failure is not really EU asylum policy as such. The failure is that the borders haven't been tight enough. And of course that the Syrian refugee crisis is of proportions that are hard to have anything to compare with. So that's the reason why there are refugees now in the EU. We've all seen the images from the Hungarian and thus the EU border with Serbia. And there's been a very intense debate, very angry debate between the Hungarian government and EU officials and other member state governments and so on. Countries mobilized their armies around these borders, Croatia, Hungary and so on. The Schengen system has ceased to exist basically with border controls coming up inside the EU. Yet Hungary, for all its horrible policies, it is an easy target, a very, very easy target, even a cheap target. What we need to do is to broaden the picture, because the message sent, for instance, from Brussels, from the European Commission, is that fences, barbed wire, that is sort of unprecedented as EU ways of stopping and arresting refugees, when in fact it's been part of the story all along. And that's why I want to take you to two illustrations from North Africa and the EU's cooperation policies there. This is the EU border in North Africa. You've probably seen images of it. They're not so commonly referred to in the media, but off and on they show up. So these are the fences, the walls created in Ceuta and Melilla. There are two colonial enclaves owned by Spain, but because they're owned by Spain, they're also owned by the European Union. They're actually more integrated to the EU than Sweden is, because the currency here is the euro. So Ceuta and Melilla are the EU's outposts in Africa. And that's why it is such an illustrating case, because these borders, these incredible fortifications that we see in Melilla and Ceuta, are financed by the European Union. And of course by Spain too. The border guards, they are trained, equipped, also with the help and assistance of the European Union, both the Spanish and the Moroccan guards. Here people die, and the shanties that have grown up and been around these fortifications on the Moroccan side for 20 years are horrific dwellings. 10 years ago, exactly almost today, in 2005, there was an incident that got some media attention, not much. But it was when a few hundred refugees attempted to storm these fences and to get over them and come into the EU. They were answered by live fire from the guards. In Ceuta, 5 people were killed and numerous others were severely injured. A few days or a few weeks later in Melilla, same thing happened. This time 6 people got shot to death by the guards and numerous others got injured. Has that happened in Hungary yet? I say yet because it could happen. No, it hasn't happened yet. Yet all the fuss about their fences and borders without any reference made to the fact that this is exactly what the EU policy prescribes. After the shootings, the massacres in Melilla and Ceuta, the Spanish government, who was a socialist, newly elected socialist government, decided on a few measures. One of them was to call for the army to go down and create peace and quiet around the fences. Another one was to increase deportation from around outside the fences on the Algerian side. And also to bring in new enforcement. So they spoke about even higher fences, more barbed wire, more technology for surveillance. The European Commission and Brussels, they were also alarmed, not by people dying or being massacred, but they were alarmed by the fact that these fences needed they needed to be strengthened. So Brussels immediately dispatched a border control expert group to go down there and survey the field and see what could be done. Then they gave 40 million euros to the Moroccan government to enforce the fortifications. And they also put pressure on the Moroccan government to sign a readmission agreement so that people could be who come to Europe could be sent back to the dictatorship of Morocco. Today, Morocco is a very good friend of the EU, particularly when it comes to refugee and asylum policy, because hardly anyone comes nowadays from Morocco to Europe. If you follow the current crisis, you see Spain is mentioned very rarely, because very few people now come from Morocco to Spain, because the cooperation there works as intended between the EU and the Moroccan government, who has been praised several times by the EU officials. Another illustration is, of course, Libya. This is interesting because it's also 10 years ago that made some media. This is José Manuel Barroso, the former EU Commission President, who was then the Commission President, and Muammar Gaddafi, of course. Why are they laughing? Why are they so at ease in each other's presence? Well, it could be because of this. A document, a council conclusion, 2-3 pages long, and I just underlined the two most interesting and most important features in this document, namely the lifting of the arms embargo on Libya that EU had in place up until 2004-05. And in return, Libya working to stem the tide of so-called illegal immigrants. That's a deal. That's a win-win situation. Libya gets weapons, the EU gets no refugees. This cooperation started early on and went on for many years, up until just before the so-called Arab Spring began. And just a few months before the Arab Spring began, the EU Commissioner Cecilia Malmström and her Stefan Jonsson, another EU Commissioner, they went down there to sign yet another agreement on so-called illegal immigration with Gaddafi and the Libyan government. The BBC reported EU and Libya have reached deal on illegal migrants. The border management agreement was reached by Stefan Jonsson and Cecilia Malmström, the EU Enlargement and Home Affairs Commissioners respectively, after talks in Tripoli. This is October 2010. The cooperation here was greatly criticized by numerous organizations, not the least Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. They did detailed studies on what this cooperation brought about. And one interesting thing is, of course, these years of cooperation actually saw a drop in people coming to Europe from the Mediterranean because Libya's policies, cooperation with EU, bore fruit. It worked as intended. again, namely to stop refugees from coming to the EU. The fact that the Libyan government hadn't signed any human rights convention, any refugee convention, didn't matter. It was a win-win deal. It was a deal too good to refuse. Interestingly, is that just months after Cecilia Malmström is down with Gaddafi in Tripoli, news is coming from the Arab Spring in Libya. Cecilia Malmström says, I'm following the development in Libya with great interest. At the moment, it is not yet clear if Gaddafi, one of the cruelest dictators in the world, has been overthrown. But it does look that his days in power are numbered. Gaddafi and his government must now be held accountable for what he has done to his own people during 42 years of terror and so on. So, this is what they say, or she says, just months before she made a very good deal with Gaddafi. The same thing from Herman van Rompuy, the then president of the European Council, and Manuel Barroso. They had just been cracking jokes, and all of a sudden they want the guy dead. He had to go for some reason. And so they bombed him, and they made sure that he was killed. But that also implied that the Libyan state was destroyed. And thus, the bulwark against refugees coming to Europe had dissolved. So, back to today. As European leaders speak about the need to take care of refugees and so on, and that they should be spread around in Europe in a solidaric way, they are simultaneously working day and night on trying to erect new borders, new ways of stemming the tide of refugees. Libya is one such place where in June a new agreement was struck between the EU to be able to not only intercept smugglers' boats, but actually bomb them inside Libyan territory. These are the new sort of measures that are thought up in Brussels as we speak. More Europe in refugee and asylum policy. Everybody talks about it. We need more Europe. But history is it's blatantly clear here that more Europe in refugee policy has meant more deaths in the Mediterranean. So maybe it's time, as I said in the opening, to think of the European Union and of European cooperation in asylum matters as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Thank you.